We're delighted to have the second panel of our Terrorism Watch Week, which began with the previous panel. So if you're just tuning in, we're glad to have you here. I'm Glen Howard, president of the Jamestown Foundation. We're having the next panel here, which is entitled Islamic State's Expansion into Africa, what it means for the future of jihadist terrorism and great power competition. So beginning with us is Jacob Zenn, editor of Terrorism Monitor publication, who's also a professor at Georgetown University and a longtime expert on all things Africa related, especially Boko Haram in Nigeria. Our next and second speaker will be none other than Dario Cristiani, who's a senior fellow of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Now, Jacob will be talking about Islamic State's expansion in Africa, and Dario will be talking about the aspects of great power competition that have been affected by this Islamic State's expansion. So we kind of got two contrasting perspectives today. I think it'll be fill in how we're seeing the geopolitics of Africa evolving, but also how the terrorism dynamic is affecting it. Many of you know Dario for his longtime contributor to Jamestown's Terrorism Monitor publication, expert on all things North Africa related. So we're glad that he's here. So we'll start the floor with Jacob, who will be giving us some slides and presentations there and kind of putting us in the weeds of what is happening with Islamic State and in developments in Africa with jihadism. Jacob, floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be back at the Jamestown Annual Conference, and I'll be delivering my presentation along with some slides that are now showing up on the screen. Just to give you insight into this picture, this is Islamic State in West Africa Province, whose acronym is ISWAP, and which is commonly known as Boko Haram, but that's simply a moniker that the group does not attribute to itself. You can see the group driving on some Turkish supplied tanks, and this was part of its most recent pledge photographs to the new ISIS Caliph. ISWAP and has evolved from its predecessors being a ragtag militia vigilante group, essentially, to being basically a semi-professional army using tanks as seen here. And it is, as my presentation will demonstrate, the foremost Islamic State province internationally, and very possibly more powerful than the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq by now. Every year, its learning curve in terms of military capabilities continues to increase. So we'll be discussing that and other threats in Africa today. Please continue. So here's the main rundown about ISWAP, which, as I just noted, is really the key group to focus on when you look at Islamic State's external provinces outside of the Middle East, or when you're focusing on Africa in particular. ISWAP is comprised of three factions. Boko Haram, the broader movement, is comprised of three factions. ISWAP is the largest of them, and that's why it will be our focus. But the second faction is that of the former leader, Abu Bakr Shekau. He was most known for his extreme ruthlessness, such that he was compared by the commanders to the armed Islamic group of Algeria, which was extremely ruthless back in the 90s. They said Shekau is a reiteration of that. And it's important to note because many of Shekau's underlings, or at least some of them, had actually been Nigerians who collaborated with the armed Islamic group as way back as the 1990s. So they witnessed how the GIA, armed Islamic group in Algeria, went to excesses, and they said Shekau has repeated this. And as a result, ISWAP killed Shekau, or actually cornered him last year in 2021, and then Shekau detonated a bomb to kill himself. So that finally got rid of what they considered the virus of Shekau, or the tumor of Shekau, and a number of Shekau's fighters have since reintegrated with ISWAP and made ISWAP actually stronger as a result. There have been some holdouts of the ruthless Shekau faction that now exist along Lake Chad under a new commander named Bakura, but they're significantly weakened. Importantly, the Bakura fighters are still loyal to Islamic State, but Islamic State has withdrawn recognition of them and only recognizes ISWAP. There's the third faction, Ansarut, which is the Al-Qaeda sub-affiliate in Nigeria. It has really suffered since emerging on the scene in 2012 because Shekau considered them infidels and began killing them, because Ansar did not consider Muslims who do not join the jihad as infidels, whereas Shekau did that. And ISWAP also tries to kill them because they're simply allied with Al-Qaeda. So Ansar has had a tough go of it over the past 10 years, but they continue to try to revive. And Al-Qaeda occasionally tries to promote them, but so far they really haven't been able to overcome either the extremeness of Shekau or Islamic State. Importantly, when we talk about ISWAP, again, the most powerful Islamic State external province, it is more than 90% focused on just Borno State, which is in northeastern Nigeria and which is highlighted in red on that map. So it's not actually a pervasive movement throughout Nigeria. It's really concentrated in Borno. On the one end, that could represent the weakness of ISWAP in that it's not expanding in the way that we saw ISIS expand throughout Syria and Iraq during its heyday. On the other end, it does represent a consolidation of ISWAP in Borno, that it's operating throughout the state. It has its communities, it has its governance, and it has basically forced the Nigerian military to set up at super camps, which are otherwise bases in Borno, where it basically sets up forts. But the writ of the Nigerian military is quite weak anywhere outside of its main bases that cover the main towns. And that's why, to a certain extent, although I'll clarify this in a moment, ISWAP is not necessarily a strategic threat to Nigeria as a whole right now because it's so consolidated in Borno. 10 years ago, it was carrying out attacks consistently throughout the center of Nigeria, which is the Muslim-Christian fault line, and that really represented a threat to the harmony of the nation. Now, I'm going to clarify that now by saying that over the past year, we have seen new trends about ISWAP moving beyond Borno and its borderlands. And those borderlands do include parts of Chad, Cameroon, and Niger, into central Nigeria. It conducted a prison break in Abuja, the capital, earlier this year. It claimed several attacks in Abuja, the capital. It claimed other attacks in parts of central Nigeria where it had not been active at all in claiming any attacks since 2015. So that is a new development. ISWAP's sleeper cells have activated in the past year in central Nigeria, and they targeted particularly Christian targets, or targets that like churches, or targets that they consider Christian, like bars. They also targeted the military. So that is a new and concerning development. Further concerning is that in the past several months, for the very first time in the group's entire history, dating back to the launch of the insurgency in 2009, ISWAP has claimed attacks in southern Nigeria, near the oil-producing regions. And that's very significant because when we talk about strategic threats, we look at central Nigeria because of the Muslim-Christian fault lines, because the capital, Abuja, where ISWAP claimed attacks, but southern Nigeria is really where the oil interests are, and that's a threat to the economics. So one of the questions we have to ask is, how serious are the threats, and what caused ISWAP to activate these sleeper cells that we long knew existed, mostly for funneling resources and logistics to the northeast? Why are they claiming attacks further south and in the center? One possibility could be that, in terms of the attacks in the south, is that this coincided with the arrival of the caliph who has just been killed. When he was announced, he really promoted ISWAP because IS is struggling elsewhere. And so they may have wanted to claim attacks in southern Nigeria to draw international attention and to support the new caliphs promoting ISWAP and saying, hey, look, now we're doing some things new. We're attacking Christians, we're attacking the south. That seems to have been a catalyst. Otherwise, there doesn't seem to be much explanation for why they activated in the south, other than the timing that coincided with the launch of the new caliph, which was last year. He's now dead. Another reason may have been that in 2021, as I noted, ISWAP's attacks led to the death of Shekau, and then Shekau integrated. Before Shekau's death, he had been trying to expand into northwestern Nigeria and into central Nigeria. And that was perhaps because he himself was on the back foot in the northeast, so he needed to move his own cells out of the northeast and try to set up camp in the northwest or the center. So when Shekau died, those cells in the center and the northwest now became ISWAP cells as they reintegrated with ISWAP. And then ISWAP simply took advantage of the new cells that it had in the center and the northwest to carry out attacks. And then that's really the main dynamic that we're seeing. But we continue to need to look for catalysts about this ISWAP expansion. If ISWAP really continues to move out of the northeast to the rest of the country, Then it's a strategic threat to Nigeria, which itself is the largest population of any African country, huge Muslim Christian fault line, huge resource interest because of its oil. And it's not called the giant of Africa for nothing. Another important note about ISWAP itself is that ISWAP is now leaderless, or you could argue that it's multi-leadered, but it does not have one single leader. And part of this results from, Shekau was originally the ISWAP leader until IS announced that he was no longer the leader, and it put in a more moderate leader, Abu Musab al-Barnawi. He led the offensive to kill Shekau, but his whereabouts now are unknown. He's either been removed, possibly for being actually too moderate, or he may have been killed. It's not clear, but ISWAP has not announced a leader in some time. Because the group is so dominant around Borno, it does have different factions that you can identify in different towns and cities around Borno. And it's very likely that each place where ISWAP has a strong contingent, it has its own leader, and they combine in a shura, but it's not clear that they've selected one individual as a leader. It's also possible that IS has had so much problem dealing with ISWAP's leaders, such as Shekau, that IS just doesn't want to announce a leader. It doesn't want a leader to be killed. It doesn't want a leader to rebel like Shekau did. So right now we're dealing with primarily a multi-leadership group, but the name of any leader is completely anonymous. But I wouldn't take that as a sign of weakness. I actually think it's probably a sign of strength that ISWAP has so many strong contingents that mostly self-manage themselves, but they're very coherent when it comes to delivering media campaigns, such as the latest videos, the latest photos that ISWAP has released pledging allegiance to the new caliph that was announced just in the past weeks. All of the factions of ISWAP in all of the towns immediately got their photos together. Notably, one of those pledge photos came from a sleeper cell in central Nigeria. They claimed it was central Nigeria, and the sleeper cell was inside of a building, whereas all of the other ISWAP photos were outside. Okay, and ISWAP's main area of operations, as you can see in the bottom, although their center is Borno, in generally speaking, they operate throughout that Lake Chad region because they extend into the bordering countries. Next slide. So here it's also important to emphasize the centrality of ISWAP to IS. IS is going through ebbs and ebbs and tides in Syria and Iraq. It's very much struggling to control territory like it used to. ISKP is still able to conduct significant attacks in Afghanistan, but it's also under pressure from international forces and the Taliban itself. IS in Southeast Asia is not what it used to be when it used to control parts of Marawi in the Philippines. Places like IS in Dagestan or other places in Russia are pretty weak. IS in Yemen is not what it used to be. But ISWAP is able to consistently deliver key propaganda and attack videos for IS, including showing ISWAP controlling territory, which ISWAP still does. And if IS still wants to maintain its image of a global caliphate that can administer taxes and whatnot, ISWAP is in the best position of any province to do that. And here you just see the Anaba magazine of IS showing an interview with a tax collector from ISWAP and discussing how they implement Sharia. They take taxes from people under its control, and then they do it presumably to the betterment of the Muslim community in Borno State. So that's why ISWAP is so important for IS. It's not clear that IS is able to resource ISWAP like it once was, because IS has its own constraints these days. But ISWAP is largely self-sufficient because it's able to tax herders and the fishing trade and the pepper trade and all different types of economic activity in the Northeast, in addition to plunder and pillage from communities that it opposes, particularly Christian communities. One important thing about ISWAP is that despite all the years of leadership turmoil, all of the factionalization that we've seen in the movement over the past 15 years, basically, since around 2009, there's never been any rumor or any disagreement about loyalty to IS. So much so that the factions that even fight each other are still loyal to IS. There's only been opposition to Al-Qaeda, there's been opposition expressed to the Taliban, but IS is really integral to the movement, all factions except for the smaller Ansarut faction. So there's very little sign that whatever happens with the IS caliphs, whatever happens with IS in Syria, there's very little sign that ISWAP will ever abandon IS. That being said, I do think it's a question that can be asked about if ISWAP remains the strongest IS province, to what extent can ISWAP and the other provinces in Africa that I'll mention in the coming slides, whether they can really hold IS together if IS continues to face difficulties in Syria and Iraq, and if it eventually faces difficulties in Afghanistan with ISKP, IS Khorasan. Because I think it's worthy of debate. You know, Somalia and Sudan, as were mentioned in the prior panel, are integral to the jihadist movement. That's actually part of where the jihadist movement began. You know, those places are a little bit closer to the Arab countries. They're a little bit more tied to the Middle East. And while we have seen Mali, at least in 2012, 2013, become an operational epicenter of Al-Qaeda, we've never seen, you know, masses of foreign fighters, for example, flow to West Africa. We've seen IS call for foreign fighters to flow to Nigeria, but it's really been a trickle. And same with Mali for Al-Qaeda. There's been calls for Al-Qaeda to help the Malian jihadists, but it's also been relatively few. The main foreign fighters under Belmokhtar in Mali in 2013 were largely from Africa itself, Sudan, Somalia, Guinea, and so forth. So whether the power of IS in Africa, or particularly West Africa, can translate towards inspiring IS supporters around the world if the group struggles in the Middle East and South Asia, I think remains a question. But for the time being, IS is really leveraging the power of the provinces in West Africa to show that the group remains relevant. Next slide. Now, although I focused on ISWAP, you really cannot look at IS in Africa without recognizing the role that IS's new province, called IS in the Sahel province, and the Congo province and the Mozambique province, you know, the way that they're performing. Previously, ISWAP included IS, Islamic State in Greater Sahara, otherwise known as ISGS. But around a year ago, IS broke them up into two and created IS Sahel, and then kept Islamic State in West Africa province. And then they broke up Congo and Mozambique, which used to be Islamic State in Central Africa province. And then they kept the Congolese fighters as IS Central Africa province. And then they created a new Mozambique province. Probably they did that organizational separation because actually it was done by the new caliph. It was his idea, that the caliph who has just died. And to create the image of more provinces, to create the presentation of more power, the ability to claim more attacks by more provinces and issue more propaganda. That was probably the organizational impetus behind it. But if there's any group that you should look at in the coming year or two as one that might surprise to the upside in its prominence, it will be Islamic State in Greater Sahara, ISGS, the group that operates for IS in Mali, Burkina, Niger, and increasingly towards littoral West Africa. Key history to understand is that it became very powerful around 2018, 2019, conducting some of the largest attacks against the regional West African militaries that have been seen in the history of jihadism in Africa. But in January 2020, France named ISGS as the #1 threat in Africa, and France began pressuring it. The Al-Qaeda affiliate in West Africa, JNIM, or the group for supporters of Islam and Muslims, also began attacking ISGS. And for the past 2 years, IS had been on the back foot. It had been losing to the Al-Qaeda affiliate. It had been facing the French forces and struggling. But in the past weeks, it has conducted major attacks again. It is reviving. Its photos showing its pledges to the new IS caliph are pretty impressive in terms of the numbers of fighters that they're showing. And there's a lot of evidence from the Al-Qaeda affiliate right now that they're worried about the rise of ISGS again, and has recovered. They're issuing notes to local communities to please help JNIM fight ISGS. And the propaganda from IS is again beginning to focus on ISGS. The probable factor behind ISGS's rise, beyond their possible support from ISWAP in Nigeria, or simply just their inspiration from the IS ideology, is simply that the West African countries are, to be frank, quite a mess politically now. We've seen 2 coups in Mali in the past 2 years or so, 2 coups in Burkina. We've seen coups in Guinea. We've seen obviously, instability in Sudan. So the political situation, we've obviously seen political turmoil in neighboring Chad. So the political situation in West Africa is completely unstable. If governance was once a problem in West Africa that facilitated jihadism, governance is only increasing. The lack of governance is only becoming more of a problem. The borders remain porous. The leaders of these coups are seemingly using France as a scapegoat. And they're, in the case of Mali, they basically kicked out France. And one can have their own qualms and criticisms of French counterterrorism, but France had been there for a number of years. It had killed a number of the leaders of these groups. And now France is gone. And not only is France gone, but other countries such as the Scandinavian countries and even Estonia that had provided various forms of support to the West African countries are also abandoning them because the coup leaders are themselves abandoning any pretense of democratic transition and return to civilian rule. And it doesn't seem like the coup leaders are really concerned about the insurgency so long as it doesn't affect their stranglehold on power in the capital. So basically all of the factors that have been known to give rise to jihadist insurgencies over the years are very prevalent in West Africa. And that's what makes the region really a powder keg with very few signs that the situation will turn. And that's what's really facilitating the rise of ISGS now. You might not be hearing about it in the news, but it's definitely the group to watch in the coming year or two. Meanwhile, in Congo, we've seen some evidence of the Congolese fighters coordinating with IS Central, particularly related to prison breaks. That's one thing that IS Central in Syria and Iraq has a lot of experience about. And it's something that IS Congo has done to significant effect within Congo to free its fighters and to capture videos of it for propaganda. Notably, ISWAP did a completely astounding prison break in Abuja itself, possibly with the help of bandits that it has collaborated with in that region. So prison breaks are actually formerly key to IS in Syria and Iraq, and now they're key to IS in Africa. The Mozambican fighters have tried some prison breaks, but have not quite succeeded. But it again shows that these IS groups in Africa are learning and coordinating with IS Central for that. ISWAP has long attacked Christians in the Northeast, and now you see Congo and Mozambique. Keep in mind that these are majority Christian countries, Congo and Mozambique, and we see them continually attacking Christian villages. This is for propaganda and for pilfer, and that's something part of their narratives. And although Congo and the Mozambique provinces are formally separated, we've often seen them release videos, such as the middle photo, where they issue videos on the same narratives at the same time, like implementing Sharia, targeting Christians. So these two groups coordinate with each other despite being organizationally separate. Now, we've also seen we've seen Congo and Uganda operate very closely against ISCAP, Islamic State Central Africa Province. And so we've seen ISCAP fight against the Ugandan troops, against the Congolese troops, but Uganda and Rwanda have poor relations. So Rwanda is not so involved in the fighting against ISCAP, which again is something you see with counterterrorism around the world. When these countries that are all dealing with the same problems are not on the same page, it makes counterterrorism much more difficult. You've also seen ISCAP attack externally to Rwanda, and potentially it will attack Uganda in the future as retribution. Likewise, Rwanda has taken a major step towards countering the Mozambican jihadists, possibly to get some type of backing from France or some international support to legitimize the rule of Kagame. But it was effective against the Mozambican fighters for most of the past 2 or 3 years. But the question is, how enduring will the commitment of Rwanda be to Mozambique? How many soldiers is it willing to commit for the long term? And we have seen a revival of the Mozambican fighters in just the past year, similar to ISGS. Perhaps there's some wariness from the Rwandan side, but mostly you've actually seen Tanzania stepping up in Mozambique in the past several months, and you've seen the Mozambican jihadists claiming a lot of attacks on Tanzanians, and the fighters in Mozambique have attacked Tanzania before, so I wouldn't be surprised to see more spillover there. And this is just the image on the bottom of the recent Mozambican pledge to IS, the new caliph. And again, they can scramble together a lot of fighters still along the beachfront, where once they had attacked the liquefied natural gas resources. Right now, they're probably not as powerful as before to take over a town like in Cabo Delgado, like a few years ago. But if trends continue, they might be able to in the future. And moving on, in conclusion, one of the possible bright sides, if you can put a silver lining to some of this, is that the US and other countries in Europe have often talked about African solutions to Africa problems. Right now, the Western countries are really preoccupied with the Russia-Ukraine issue, arguably China, Taiwan, and Iran. And 7 years ago, when ISIS was in its heyday, there was a lot of attention towards combating ISIS in West Africa, or in Africa generally, like France, for example, in January 2020, focusing on targeting ISGS. We don't see that right now, but it does give the African countries a chance to really engage in counterterrorism for themselves with probably as little attention from the West as I've seen in the past decade since I've covered this. So the question is, can they actually develop the solutions to their problems with some Western support, but not the same attention as, say, 5 or 7 years ago? So far, the jury's still out on it, but from West Africa, it's not promising. The Rwandan case in Mozambique was promising, but there's questions about the endurance of Rwanda. And in Congo, it's perhaps a stalemate, but we'll see how well the Tanzanians and the Ugandans and the Congolese can work together, and whether Rwanda can take part with them. But this is something to really watch. It's important to note, by the way, that Al-Shabaab in Somalia, in terms of controlling territory and sophistication of governance, if not necessarily sophistication in tactics, like as Bruce Hoffman mentioned, it hasn't really achieved some of the sophistication as other Al-Qaeda affiliates like A2AP. It still is very sophisticated in administration, and they're in a stalemate, I would say, with the AMISOM, with international forces there. But Al-Shabaab is obviously not going away anytime soon. And the final thing to watch for, I would say, is just the new fronts that continue to open. Names like Burkina Faso was a new front 6 years ago. Now it's in turmoil. It's completely enveloped by the jihadists around the different regions of the country. But now we're talking about Togo, Benin, the borders of Ghana, the borders of Cote d'Ivoire, perhaps soon the borders of Senegal. We're now looking at Tanzania, the threats from the Mozambican jihadists moving up there. South Africa as a logistics hub for the Mozambican jihadists and financing, and the Congolese moving into Tanzania and Rwanda. So there's a lot of new names of new countries that we haven't talked about when it comes to jihadism for a long time, Ghana as well. And they're now emerging on the scene. And I'll just make the comparison that 6 years ago, when you heard Burkina Faso, you wouldn't really associate it with jihadism. And now, as I mentioned, it's enveloped. So we need to pay a lot of attention to Togo and Benin as analysts. And I'm not sure if the counterterrorism attention is there right now due to attention being focused elsewhere in the world. But if it's not now, and nothing is done about the expansion by not only the IS groups, but the Al-Qaeda groups towards particularly the West African littoral states, I'm pretty sure in several years, we will be forced to pay attention to those countries if we're not doing it now. So I'll be looking forward to questions, later in the panel, and I'm sure Dario Cristiani has a lot of important insights to add to this.
Yes, Dario, tell us about the great power competition and what Jacob has talked about and how that's opened the door for them.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm sorry for my voice, but as you can easily guess, I was a victim of one of this wave of flu recently. So I think I will actually connect with several of the insights that Jacob gave us in his presentation. And, let me first start. I participated for the first time in Jamestown conferences in 2010. And talking at that time of states, not only like great powers in this context, was almost impossible. At that time, we were all focusing on sub-state groups, the shifting happening inside Al-Qaeda and Islamic Maghreb that was turning more into a Sahelian actor, a hybrid actor, focus not only or not primarily on pure jihadi activities, but was very much becoming a normal para-mafia or narco organization and so on and so forth. If we look at the last conference, we actually did here in DC in person in 2019. I presented on Libya, and in that panel, we actually discussed the relevance of external powers and great powers in the Libyan dynamics. 3 years later, I think we are at the point in which we can clearly see how the African continent is becoming an extremely relevant theater for the re-emergence of multipolarism in the global arena. And this multipolarism does not only involve the so-called global powers like China, Russia, the United States, European countries, and many of these European countries used to be colonial powers in Africa, but also countries like India, Turkey, the Gulf countries, and even more relevant, there is the rise of African middle powers, let's say, that are intervening. Jacob mentioned Rwanda, that I think is a very interesting case, referring to Mozambique, but also to Benin, for instance. There is an increasing competition. Of course, I can talk a little bit more about that between Algeria and Morocco in shaping continental dynamics, with Morocco that is also trying, for instance, not only to use economic tools or like just normal diplomacy, but even soft power tools like investing in the education and training of imams across the continent, and to export its model of anti-radicalization. So my point with this presentation is that the spread of jihad in Africa, the rise of the Islamic State, but more importantly, in some of the countries that I will be covering here, the relevance that Al-Qaeda groups have acquired and their capacity to adapt to the local context. Because again, 10, 15 years ago, we might have questioned the capacities of these groups based in Algeria or in North Africa to be able to make inroads into Mali or the Sahel by, for instance, attracting local recruits. Instead, 15 years later, we know that these groups, they have been able to speak to marginalized communities like the Fulani or the Tuareg, to, let's say, use like jihadist rhetoric to change, to actually penetrate the local cleavages, the local conflicts existing between pastoralists and herders. In many cases, this socioeconomic conflict used to have also like an ethnic dimension. They manage to take advantage of loopholes in governance. And on this, I don't think it's only a matter of capacities. Because yes, we're talking about states that lack capacities in many cases, but also to a certain extent, these states, they also lack the willingness to act in favor of certain groups, because the central power might have a preference for specific groups. Historically, there might be repression or discrimination against the Fulani or the Tuareg and so on and so forth. So there are these many cleavages that in many cases are not necessarily just ethnic or racial, but they're also economic, classist, like cleavages of class, etc. And the spread of this phenomenon push external powers to intervene and to pay attention. This is the case of France in 2014, that was essential to stop the southward, let's say, march of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and its associates toward Bamako. But at the same time, the French counterterrorist operations in the region also created, let's say, a sort of environment in which local elites, as Jacob already mentioned, were more and more at odds with the French leadership on this, but also for other countries to intervene. And I think if we take three countries, Libya, Mali, and Burkina Faso, we can clearly see how the chaos that emerged in these countries linked to activities from jihadi organizations paved the way for the penetration of Russia, for instance. And so my point about jihad and global power competition is that Africa will be more and more central in global dynamics for demographic reasons. I think the fact that we are talking about this today in DC is helpful, not helpful, but we are testimonies of how the United States are looking extremely carefully towards Africa with the summit that has been held here in DC these days with African leaders. So there is an increasing awareness among great powers that Africa is going to be an extremely relevant area for this multipolar competition. Of course, here I will not go too much in depth regarding the role of China, but we might actually have an entire conference just on that. And from this point of view, let me highlight an element which is not only just Africa as a passive theater for other powers to, let's say, fight and compete, but as I mentioned before, the spread of jihadism in areas that before were untouched by this phenomenon is creating, I don't want to say opportunities, but it's creating the conditions even for African countries to intervene, to become more relevant, so that there is this dialectic between African powers, global powers, and this perception that the spread of jihad in Mali, in Burkina, now is not anymore, is actually a reality, like a consolidated reality. But what Jacob was mentioning, Togo, Benin, Ghana, Ivory Coast, Senegal, Mozambique, and so on and so forth. These are all areas that have not known this kind of developments in the past, that exactly for this reason, their elites, their security forces might not have the expertise that Algeria has built over the years, for instance. And this creates the need for these countries to get external support, to increase cooperation among them. We might talk about the Accra initiative that was launched in 2017, or the cooperation among the Sahelian countries, etc. So, if we focus on Mali and Burkina Faso in what happened more recently over the past 2 years, but we can actually see how the problems that France encountered, especially in Mali, paved the way for the penetration of Russia and the penetration of the Wagner Group. Russia has been trying to do something similar in Burkina Faso, although the conditions there are a little bit different. Mali has a history of cooperation with the Soviet Union back in the days. Burkina Faso is a little bit different, but the thing is, Russia has had the capacity of capitalize on this, on the criticism that France has received. Jacob mentioned how the inward-looking approach of the junta in Mali, but also because there are a number of contradictions in the French role played in the region. France was extremely successful if we look at the numbers and let's say the relevance of the leaders France has killed. But 10 years after the beginning, we are 2000, yes, it's 10 years after Serval and Operation Barkhane, like these groups from being based in northern Mali and southern Algeria and in Libya, now they are all across West Africa. So from an empirical point of view, we can actually say that France failed in its counter-terrorist attempts. France also lost legitimacy in the eyes of many, not only of the current ruling elites, but one big issue that France used to have with the entire Malian, for instance, civil society, was this clash existing between the French perception that there was no way to negotiate with any of these groups, while instead local civil societies, they tend to make a differentiation between groups that are completely foreigner to the local reality and groups that instead have connections with the groups and realities on the ground. The classic case is Ansar Dine in Mali, the Tuaregs, but also with the groups linked to Fulani fighters. And this also opened, it has created like another paradox. The Malian ruling elite, the Malian civil society, they wanted to get rid of France. Getting rid of France, they open up the space for Wagner to enter and to become their major counter-terrorist partner. But it's not that Wagner is, an actor supporting dialogue with some of these jihadist groups. But on the contrary, they have killed indiscriminately, like over the past months, civilian fighters, etc. And clearly, there is a connection here also with the war in Ukraine and the fact that Russia, over the past year, has desperately trying to occupy certain spaces in Africa and elsewhere that might be helpful for its plans in its near abroad, but also has some rumors suggested that Russia was more and more involved in Africa because it needed to get military material, not only actually weapons, but also like things that are like uniforms and other stuff from Africa. And like to enter in my conclusion. So we can see that the pressure that the spread of jihadists has on elites and countries across West Africa need for these countries an increased cooperation with specific actors that have counterterrorism know-how and capacities, will push these countries actually to spend more and more in defense, security, training, recruitment, etc. And this clearly opened up the space for external penetration. Africa.
So you're saying that in the case of Mali and France leaving, that's opening the door to the Russians. So are you implying that the Russians then will enter into Mali, providing weapons, training, and replace France in this area?
I think this is what Wagner has been doing so far. If we look at the evidence from social media of Wagner providing training to Malian troops, etc., there we might discuss the specifics of these connections, whether this is, supported by specific groups inside Mali that might have vested interest in having this relationship with Wagner, but it's a reality. Wagner has, and the thing is that we might see Wagner as a threat, but some elites in Africa, if they look at the Wagner curricula in Libya or in Syria, for instance, they might actually think that Wagner can be a very helpful partner in 2019 when we were discussing about Libya and great powers. It was just at the beginning of the Turkish intervention in Libya, but we were discussing here at the beginning of December 2019, and that was the moment in which Haftar was able to actually push towards Tripoli because of the support that Wagner troops gave to him between September and November of 2019. So the thing is, the issue at stake here is that this, the fact that France has officially terminated Operation Barkhane, has left Mali, has created a vacuum that Wagner and Russia is trying to exploit. This would be more and more the case, as Jacob said, that we should monitor the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara. And indeed, if 5 years ago we were discussing of jihad in Togo and Benin, we might have said, well, it's impossible that these groups can be capable of entering these countries. And instead, if we look at what Togo has been going through over the past few months, we see how relevant these attacks have been, which means, and I conclude here, that as we have seen in Libya, Mali, and Burkina Faso, the rise of jihadist groups create the conditions for a greater penetration from external powers. And since Africa is going to be one of the major theaters of the return of a multipolar order in which not only great powers per se, China, Russia, United States, but also middle powers with great power ambitions or regional power will interact. These two elements in the future cannot be analyzed on their own, but they must always be seen as a part of a continuum, or the connection between these two dynamics cannot be analyzed, let's say, on their own. And I think the debate on this specific issue is not particularly developed yet. We tend still to analyze jihadi groups as sub-state organizations operating and spreading across the continent, and great power competition as something that doesn't really have a connection and a dimension that could be seen as part of this development. Instead, my opinion is that we should start looking more and more at these two dimensions together, because they will be extremely relevant in shaping the future of Africa, in shaping the future of global politics, but also in telling us whether African jihadi groups based in Africa can actually represent the new avant-garde of Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. Because as we have seen with the debate on the successors on the succession of al-Zawahiri, there is a debate inside Al-Qaeda about whether African leaders might be relevant from this point. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much for listening, despite my voice is not at the best today, and I look forward.
We'll give you a chance here to rest a little bit. Thank you, Dario, for that kind of overview of the region. And your points are taken here. This was what Jacob brought up in the previous panel with a question of Bruce Hoffman, was about the emotional attachment of these groups to Al-Qaeda Central or ISIS Central. And there seems to be a debate about that, but then you're saying that they could be the avant-garde of these organizations.
Well, yeah, I think it's clear, observing how these groups have been able to develop over the past 10 years, that they might have an emotional attachment to Al Qaeda Central, but from an operational point of view, this attachment is minimal in the sense that it's their knowledge of the territory, it's their local interests that drive their actions, not very much. From this point of view, the Islamic State used to be a more vertical organization. If we look at how ISIS entered Libya and developed in Libya, like the agenda was dictated by Raqqa, something that instead has never been the case, even in Mali, when there was the Islamist takeover after the Tuareg takeover in northern Mali. You might remember the emergence of these letters sent by Drukdel to the local leadership of Al Qaeda.
And Drukdel is for those who people don't follow, it's AQIM.
The former QIM emir who was killed actually by the French in northern Mali, and in which he was asking the local fighters to not implement the Sharia, or like to actually be respectful of local, let's say, traditions, and to be gradual in the implementation of the Islamic rule, because he feared that they might have lost the support of the locals, which means that from this point of view, like local feelings, local sensibilities, but this is also the case with what among the scholars has been known as the emergence of rural jihad, or the jihad for the marginals, that was pushed ahead by Jamal Okacha and the leadership of Al Qaeda in Mali in order to win the sympathies, as I said before, of those communities that felt discriminated, underrepresented, or under threat, for instance, because of the impact that climate change, desertification, environmental problems they had on the balances between pastoralists and herders regarding the control of livestock, agriculture, etc., etc. So the emotional attachment might be, let's say, the heart might be with Al Qaeda Central, but the mind and the operational priorities are local. And my point with this group being potentially the new vanguards is that because in the relative power among organizations, my impression is that they will become more and more central, we might also witness a shift that maybe within Al Qaeda might be a little bit more significant than the Islamic State when it comes to the choice of the leaders and the relevance that these groups have.
It would seem to me that although IS is generally more prevalent in Africa nowadays than Al Qaeda does have the leaders with the global credibility that could allow Al Qaeda to do more of a shift to Africa, because, for example, the leaders of AQIM are Algerian, they speak Arabic, they have some experience within the broader Afghan jihad milieu. And even Iyad Agali, the leader of the Malian affiliate, he's been a Malian diplomat back in the day in Saudi, he's been to Pakistan, he's been to France. So it seems like these leaders have faces to the name and like more cachet among Al Qaeda globally, whereas the IS leaders in Africa, in the case of ISWAP, they're nameless. Mozambique and Congo, they're not well known, and even Al-Sahrawi, the former leader of IS in the Sahel, he's now dead, and his subordinates don't really have global cachet. So from a leadership perspective, Al Qaeda seems to be able to have more charisma, even though on the ground, IS is still stronger in Africa.
So as we had in the other panel discussed the future of Al Qaeda, if someone like Saif al-Adil becomes the head of Al Qaeda and then he decides to launch more operational initiatives, having an experience of working, as Bruce Hoffman was pointing out, his experience of working in Africa in Mogadishu and other places. So what you're saying is, from a USCT perspective, counterterrorism strategy concerns is if Al-Qaeda Central becomes active again, then these local affiliates who have hearts and minds, but priorities are elsewhere in Africa, that Al-Qaeda could call upon some of these groups for their sympathies to do another type of attack on a U.S. embassy or something like that. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yes, but there might be a tension in that, insofar as I don't think the local Al-Qaeda affiliates, at least in West Africa, necessarily want to carry out these big international attention attacks. The center might want that in order to show that Al-Qaeda is still relevant, and maybe if Saif Adel becomes a leader, to show that he can still manage attacks on the Western Africa. But the Al-Qaeda in Mali, for example, sort of benefits from not carrying out these attacks on hotels anymore. They haven't done it for several years, because this means that the Western press is not focused on what they're doing, and they get to slowly expand their influence on the ground without making the US have to think of a response to, say, a hotel attack in Bamako. And that's why strategically Al-Qaeda has not really done that in Mali lately. So there might be a tension between.
Yeah, and I think on this, like, we can actually, there was part of my presentation that I skipped because of time concerns regarding how Africa was essential in the globalization of Al-Qaeda before 9/11. But in that case, actually, it was using the fact that Africa was at the margins of the attention of the United States and other countries, that local security conditions were a bit more permissive in regard to target diplomatic facilities, etc. Instead, these days, like, while Africa might represent like an area in which Al-Qaeda returns to be properly global, the dynamics are different and the priorities are somehow the priorities are completely changed compared to the 90s. In the 90s, it was using Africa for global purposes, and instead these days is being active in Africa, entrenching, like exploiting African cleavages to be globally relevant, but not like attacking like targets that are necessarily linked to global powers in the countries in which they are active.
Now, could you see some of these actors, say, attacking an oil refinery, taking Westerners as hostage, in reaction to?
I think actually there is a trend that might be reemerging these days regarding the fact that let's not forget that in Mali, in Burkina Faso, the Islamic State groups and Al-Qaeda groups are actually also fighting each other. And for instance, there is an increasing pressure on Al-Qaeda to find the means to fund their operations. So I think
Al-Qaeda Central providing funds could stop them from fighting each other. That would be
no. I mean, I don't really
to focus on something else.
I don't really think providing funds might stop these groups from fighting each other, but I don't really know how Al-Qaeda Central might actually these days provide, like, of course, if they start providing funds, their influence might increase. I don't really know on this, like, how this could become a reality. But for instance, I think recently there were some like rumors about, not sure if a German or a Belgian priest being kidnapped in Mali. And now I'm not sure about the details. So, and because especially the groups of Al-Qaeda that are now operating in Mali and Burkina, they were the same groups that after the Algerian counterterrorism managed to readapt after these groups imported the tactics from Iraq and Afghanistan. And they started this, we call it in an article that I wrote for Jamestown in 2010, the kidnapping industry. And they were extremely active back in the days in kidnappings, certain nationalities because
It was
these groups
lucrative.
is lucrative, and these groups, they know that the Americans might have an approach, but the Italians or the Spanish might have a very different approach. So, for instance,
You mean they pay?
basically, so it happened like that article was focused on the kidnapping of 3 aid workers, 2 from Spain and 1 from Italy. Her name was Rossella Urru. And this was actually for years a sort also of economic jihad against local countries, because tourism in the Sahara completely disappeared because of this. Over the past few years, it was less relevant, but there were still cases. But now there are rumors that this might return to be an
Because
issue
COVID also prevented
Well,
people from
also-
traveling. So what you're saying is that tourism may resume.
may resume and may represent
and
an
with it-
opportunity for these groups to kidnap foreigners and use them as like means to fund their operations if the countries of these foreigners are willing to pay. On this, there is, as you know, a debate within the Western world between.
So does this mean that people are kidnapped in Mali, that we're going to turn to Wagner and ask them for assistance in freeing kidnappers because France is no longer playing a role? What does it mean with France being out of the region now?
Well, I mean, on this, like
Or diminished?
I never thought about actually Wagner like having like a potential role on this, but like what I actually think is that with the return of tourism, or even just like of aid workers, priests, etc., there might be opportunities, not necessarily just for jihadi groups, but also for criminal gangs that might use these kidnappings as a way to make more money, selling people to groups. And the fact that France is out of Mali and that there is a reorganization of the European presence, I think undermine the capacity of Western countries to actually intervene in the region. The fact that when France decided to leave all the other countries that Jacob mentioned, Estonia, but for instance, as an Italian, I know extremely well that the previous government was extremely active in having Italian troops operating in Mali together with French and other European troops. And these troops were also forced to leave because of the fact that France had to leave. So from this point of view, I think Europeans, on the one hand, should reorganize themselves, and then on the other, they should realize, and I think this is a problem that Western countries in general have, that here it's not very much about saving Africa. So having this paternalistic approach towards the area, but actually interacting with African powers and African leaders in a more balanced way and say, look, we are here to help, but we also need your help for us to be successful. So having a more balanced relationship. This is not necessarily what happens with other countries, but when China intervenes in the region, when Russia intervenes in the region, when Turkey intervenes in the region, for instance, these countries, they don't really have democratic conditionality or this kind of things that in some cases, and one of the big problems with France was the double standards that France adopted in regard to the coup d'etat in Mali and Burkina, and the same thing that happened in Chad. So from this point of view, there is also some humility that needs to be shown by European and Western countries in dealing with the region, realizing that maybe the time of democratic conditionality, especially if it's not enforced across the board, but it's selective, should be revised in order to be more effective in cooperating with regional governments and power.
Okay. Well, listen, we want to go to the questions of the audience. People here, does anybody have any questions? Is there anybody online that we want to wants to ask a question of our panelists speaking today? No, we don't have anything. Not online. Anything? Jacob, do you have any comments? Anyone here? What? Oh, sorry. Yes, the young lady in the back.
So I was wondering, I guess, two framing points to then ask the question.
2 points. Okay.
2 points and a question. So I was looking recently at attacks by Jaina mostly, but also ISGS and Benin, Togo, and then in those kind of border areas right outside those countries. And there is a 82% no lethality rate with their events perpetrated, with like 94 with 5 fatalities and under. So that's some indicator in my eyes, right, of intentional localization and a desire to maintain hold on territory. So that point, with the second point being, I was speaking with Center for Democratic Development in Ghana, which is supported by US and other, they're like kind of where the Afrobarometer was born. So they were speaking about how there's kind of complacency, right, general complacency in Ghana towards this terrorism issue, right, on the ground. The public doesn't see this as something that's happening tomorrow to them. So with this low lethality and with this kind of complacency, that doesn't seem like a promising combination. So what is the US's role, right? Like how or who is responsible in the international space or in the kind of the regional state space? Who is it held to kind of make this threat more salient to the state governments and to the public?
So to repeat the question, who's responsible for overseeing this kind of assistance at the local level?
Those 2 points that indicate like, okay, this is going to be something that no one's going to act on until it happens, and then it's too late, right?
In particular, looking at Togo, Benin, and these countries like
maybe
Ghana.
the spread of the
Well, I might say that although we spoke about a lot of negative examples today, one of the thus far more positive examples of this type of collaboration that works is the case of Niger. Niger is obviously facing significant security risks, but this was also a country where you've seen the AQ affiliate JNIM, you've seen ISGS venture into the territory of Niger across the border from Mali and Burkina, and you've seen ISWAP and the other factions move into DIFA and these parts of Niger. But yet that country's politics has remained stable. The country's cooperation in counterterrorism with the US, for example, has also remained pretty stable, if not growing. And the country, as far as I've seen it in the Boko Haram case, working with different ethnicities and like vigilante patrols and being inclusive has actually worked fairly well, despite being perhaps the poorest country in the region. So if you could take that model and that level of cooperation and transpose it to, say, the Togo case, the Benin case, the Ghana case, Cote d'Ivoire case, Senegal case, and make sure that these countries' politics don't turn into what we've seen in Mali or Burkina, that the counterterrorism support evolves in a way similar to Niger, trusted, where Niger takes the lead, but the US provides support. We've seen it work. So in terms of models that work, we see the Niger model. In terms of the models that have not worked, the Burkina and Mali. So it might be possible just to try to transpose models. And in the end, it's the responsibility of the local country, the host country, and then say the outside support. But we can look at cases that work. That's probably what I would turn to first.
Yeah, I think actually, if I can add something on this, also at the European Union level, there is the perception that Niger is a sort of model state from this point of view. And I think today there was something that was released by the Commission regarding the role of Niger as a partner for the Europeans. On this, maybe we can also refer to the other successful story, although this one is a little bit like older, which is Mauritania. Because if we look at the process of regionalization of Algerian terrorism, Mauritania was the first country in which the GSPC, back in the days before the rebranding into Al-Qaeda, operated in 2005. There have been for years concerns that Mauritania might have been the weak Sahelian Maghrebi links, and instead, like over the past 10 years, they have developed like capacities that are particularly significant for the region. And we have seen that indeed, like Mauritania is a sort of oasis of stability in this area. So there are like positive examples. Like on this, we always tend to focus like on the negatives, but and I think also like to add something, Togo, for instance, okay, they have been suffering by rising attacks, a rising number of casualties, but they have been very active in tackling the issue, not only from a security perspective, but also from the perspective of, for instance, like fostering development in the region of the savannas, which is the weak link of its territory at the moment, but also in being active in, for instance, supporting Mali and other regional countries in tackling these issues. So as I said, like, and this was part of my presentation, there is also like an African activism on this that we as European, I mean, myself as a European, we as Western world and the friends here in the United States might look as like an opportunity for engagement in a different way than the past, and has like options to be developed in order to be more effective in tackling these regional problems.
One of the things that has come up is Wagner in Libya. Where do they stand now? Where do we stand with Haftar and the Russian presence in Libya?
Well, I mean, from the information available, it's one of the groups that like Wagner fighters, part of those who were active in Libya, they actually joined Wagner forces in Ukraine. They didn't live.
Are they withdrawing forces?
I mean,
from
they're
Libya
not
to-
withdrawing it, not entirely. Like the thing is that for Russia, there is like a significant interest in keeping a role in Libya. Haftar without Wagner forces, it might have been long
Has gotten
gone.
weaker.
The thing is that Wagner is essential for the control of Haftar of the terminals and the oil facilities in the Sirte basin. So actually, from this point of view, I think it's like there is a history of the lack of efficiency of Haftar people, and even back in 2019, when Haftar started his military operation against Tripoli, he actually needed the support of Wagner in the fall of 2019 to shift the balance on the ground. Then a minimal Turkish intervention started in December 2019, lead to like a shifting reality on the ground that 1 year later would turn into the ceasefire that was established in October 2020. So from this point of view, like Wagner troops, they have always been essential for Haftar. They are also essential for Haftar these days, although the numbers are not the same numbers that we used to have in 2019 and 2020 on the ground, because Russia has clearly like necessities somewhere else.
And what about the training of the Turkish army, training the Libyan army? The Turks are building a new Libyan army. Where does that stand in terms of Libya?
Well, the Turks were particularly effective in, I would say, not only in the training of Libyan forces, but also in keeping the militias in the western part of Libya in check. And from this point of view, I think using specific
How do the Turks keep them in check?
through, I would say, a significant knowledge of the intricacies of these groups, and the fact that before intervening directly, they brought in Libya a number of Syrian Turkomans that helped them to actually create a sort of like balance of power on the territory. Although from this point of view, in Libya with with the shifting alliances, the fact that Bashaga and Maitig became, I don't want to say allies, but they basically struck a deal with Haftar in order to create another government. The situation there
And
has
keep
changed.
exporting oil. Is it more based upon the oil?
Well, I mean, the thing with exporting oil is that something that
Why is Haftar behaving himself?
I mean, I wouldn't really say that he's behaving like in the sense that
Okay, so it's not.
like he keeps you can, well, the thing is that I don't want to be too harsh on this, but by now Haftar should have been out of the picture in Libya. Yeah, especially after the ceasefire of 2020, like he failed entirely in his attempt to take the control of Tripoli. Then for a number of reasons that I think mostly are related to the connections that he has with a number of external power, he managed to remain relevant in the Libyan context. Like not only thanks to the Russians, but also thanks to the Emirati, the Egyptians,
yeah.
the French, I would say, and other countries. He maintains the control, the actual control on many of the Libyan oil resources. And as we have seen after the Berlin conference, he still has the ambition of using that as a wild card every now and then. So when there was the beginning of the war in Ukraine, I think there was a moment in which there was still a blockade in Libya, and that blockade was helpful to keep oil prices after a certain level. At the moment, I think in Libya, we are witnessing a sort of like, every actor is on a sort of wait and see like attitude, like trying to understand like what external powers like want, and also like there is no much activity from this point of view. But like despite the needs of Russia in Ukraine, Wagner has maintained a presence in Libya, showing that for Russia, Libya is a crucial element of its overall strategy, and the fact that in Libya there are like still two governments like in competition, that like it's a country in which external powers are particularly relevant. And again, as I said, there is a sort of wait and see approach by all the actors on the ground, but Libya maintained this potential to actually deflagrate at some point and to represent again what represented in 2019 as one of the epicenters of like instability in the Mediterranean. I mean, I'm sorry we cannot talk more.
Yeah, that's it's a very intriguing issue. I know Africa is a very large continent. We're trying to cover all these dimensions, and especially CT policy and how it affects the U.S. and great power.
Plus, like I tend to focus on North Africa, so it's like,
Yes, I
it's a
wanted to
very
get that
specific-
in here into the conversation. So, Jacob, do you have any parting comments as we wrap this up and conclude?
No, nothing except,
What do we watch for in 2022?
well, in terms of groups,
2023.
2030, yeah, the new year. Well, I think the things that we talked about today, the growth of groups like ISGS that really hasn't been focused on recently, and its recent expansion has been unprecedented. The possible expansion of ISWAP. I mean, the conditions for group expansion and territorial control are all there in Africa right now. But at the same time, I do think mentioning China, Russia, countries like Turkey in the north, whatever France will do in West Africa, also highlights the role of geopolitical competition. And that's also in countries that we didn't mention today, like Sudan. There's an ongoing crisis in Ethiopia. They have a conflict with Egypt. There's the ports in Djibouti where China is trying to develop a presence. I mean, there's a lot of geopolitical competition that interrelates with the various conflicts on the continent. And just to see the relationships between jihadists and other insurgencies and the geopolitical interests in the continent, which are both only increasing.
So there we go. The great scramble for Africa continues. So stay tuned and we'll be there next year. So Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We will be meeting again here tomorrow at 2 p.m. for the third part of our Terrorism Watch Week, which will be entitled Terrorism, the Iran in Turmoil. So we'll be having Michael Duran and Alex Patenka from the Middle East Institute speaking about where is Iran going. So thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you here in the future. Thank you.